It began with a sound, a low, guttural rustle like wet leaves dragged across the ground. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of cicadas, but it had a cadence, a purpose. Sitting on the tatama floor of my grandfather's countryside home in Aomori Prefecture, I paused mid-sip of green tea, ears straining to confirm that it wasn't just the wind or an overactive imagination. Grandfather's house was nestled on the edge of a dense forest, a place he often described as teeming with spirits. For as long as I could remember, he had warned me of the yokai, supernatural beings said to inhabit the woods. His stories were vivid, painting creatures of all shapes and temperaments, but I had always dismissed them as the ramblings of an eccentric old man. That night, though, something about the atmosphere felt off kilter. The shoji screens rattled softly, though there was no breeze. I set my tea down, my hands trembling slightly. It was then I noticed the eyes, large, bulbous, and gleaming with an unsettling intensity. They stared at me from beyond the shoji. Their whites were tinged with a sickly yellow hue, the iris's inky pools that seemed to stretch far deeper than their spherical confines should allow. They blinked once, slowly, as if aware of my scrutiny. I froze. The eyes remained fixed on me, unblinking now, their gaze laden with something that wasn't malice but wasn't innocence either. It was an alien curiosity, the kind that dissected rather than explored. "Grandfather," I called, my voice cracking. He shuffled in from the kitchen, his wooden get-a clacking against the floor. "What is it, Riku?" I pointed to the shoji, unable to form coherent words. His face hardened immediately. "It's here," he said grimly. "Close the screens." I did as I was told, sliding the wooden frames until the creature was obscured, though its shadow loomed large against the paper. My hands fumbled with the latch, heart hammering as if trying to break free of my chest. "What is it?" I demanded, panic lacing my voice. Grandfather didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for the lacquered chest where he kept a bundle of aged talismans and prayer scrolls. Pulling one free, he began muttering a chant under his breath, the words ancient and guttural, resonating with a power I didn't understand. "The Kurobōzu," he said finally. "The Black Monk." According to Grandfather, the Kurobōzu was a spirit of the forest, an amalgamation of lost souls and forgotten despair. It was said to appear to those who were haunted by regret, feeding on their anguish and growing stronger with each encounter. "The eyes," he said, his own darting to the sealed shoji. "They see more than just the surface. They see your kokoro, your heart, your soul. If it finds weakness, it will burrow into you like a parasite." His words sent a chill down my spine. I thought back to my recent arguments with my parents, my estranged friendships, and the unshakable guilt I carried over things left unsaid. If the Kurobōzu truly thrived on regret, I was a buffet. "Why is it here?" I asked, my voice a whisper. "It's drawn to houses on the border of the forest," he said, his tone weighted with years of knowledge. "But why it chooses its victims, no one knows. Perhaps it sensed something in you." I bristled at his implication, but had no time to argue. The sound of the rustling returned, louder now, accompanied by a low, throaty hum. It reverberated through the house, shaking the wooden beams and rattling the dishes. "It's testing the barriers," Grandfather said, his voice tight. He handed me a talisman and gestured for me to place it on the front door. As I moved through the house, the shadows seemed to deepen, the air growing heavier with each step. My fingers fumbled with the talisman as I affixed it to the wood, muttering the chant Grandfather had taught me. The rustling stopped. I turned to see the shadow of the creature retreating from the shoji. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. That night, I lay awake in the narrow futon, staring at the wooden ceiling. The house was deathly silent, save for the occasional groan of the floorboards as they settled. I clutched the talisman Grandfather had given me, its edges worn and frayed from decades of use. Sleep came fitfully, and when it did, it brought dreams that felt too vivid to be mere figments of my imagination. I was in the forest, running blindly through the trees. The Kurobōzu was behind me, its shaggy, matted fur rustling with every step. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the buzzing sound filled my ears, drowning out my own ragged breaths. When I awoke, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the room. Grandfather was already up, seated at the low wooden table with a cup of tea in his gnarled hands. It won't stop, he said without looking at me. Not until it gets what it wants. What does it want? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Reckoning, he said simply. By midday, the tension in the house had become unbearable. The air seemed to hum with an unseen energy, and the shadows in the corners felt darker, deeper. Grandfather finally made the decision. We would confront the Kurobōzu on its own ground. The forest was dense and suffocating, its canopy blocking out most of the sunlight. As we moved deeper, the buzzing sound returned, faint at first but growing louder with every step. It's close, Grandfather said, his hand tightening on the prayer staff he carried. We came to a clearing where the ground was littered with mushrooms, thick, bulbous things that seemed to pulse with a faint light. In the center stood the Kurobōzu. Its form was massive, a hulking mass of fur and shadow that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Its bulging eyes locked onto us, unblinking and full of that same alien curiosity. It tilted its head, the motion almost childlike, and let out a low, resonant hum that rattled my very bones. Do not look into its eyes, Grandfather warned. The creature moved closer, its fur rippling as if alive. The air around it seemed to distort, bending light and sound into something incomprehensible. Grandfather began chanting, his voice strong and unwavering. The talismans in his hand glowed faintly, their power a fragile shield against the overwhelming presence of the Kurobōzu. But then the creature spoke. Its voice was a cacophony, 1,000 whispers layered atop one another, each one a fragment of something once human. Why do you fight? It asked. Your guilt feeds me. Your regret sustains me. I felt its gaze boring into me, peeling back the layers of my soul. Memories surfaced unbidden. Every failure, every moment of selfishness, every cruel word. Riku, Grandfather shouted, pulling me back. I hadn't realized I'd taken a step toward the creature. My legs felt like lead, my body no longer my own. Grandfather threw the talismans at the creature, their light erupting into a brilliant flash. The Kurobōzu recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. Now, Grandfather shouted, his voice strained. I didn't know what he meant, but instinct took over. I grabbed a branch from the ground and plunged it into the earth, focusing all my will into the act. The ground trembled, and the mushrooms began to wither, their light fading. The creature let out an unearthly scream, its body convulsing as the forest seemed to close in around it. Shadows writhed and twisted, and then, with a final guttural roar, the Kurobōzu was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. We returned to the house, exhausted and shaken. Grandfather said little, his face pale and drawn. Will it come back? I asked. He didn't answer right away. Spirits like that don't disappear. They only wait. I still see it sometimes, reflected in windows or lurking at the edge of my dreams. Its eyes are always watching, unblinking and patient, waiting for the moment my regrets grow too heavy to bear.